All right. Okay. Well, all right. Well, thank you for joining our CSP, our what month is it? September, man. Our September webinar series. For some reason, I had it in my head that it was October already. This is our opportunity to continue our 2021 series on developing and managing a end-to-end endpoint management solution. We continue today with looking at managing Windows OS as a life cycle, and we have Chris Ball here to present today. So Chris, it's all yours.
Great, thank you, sir. All right, everybody. So here we'll just kind of jump right in here and get right to the agenda. So today we're going to talk about, what that desktop OS lifecycle is. It's been going on since Windows 10 back in 2015 when it was released, and they've made quite a few changes to that as time has went on. So we're going to kind of discuss some of those things. We'll talk about your support lifecycle, what patching actually looks like, and how some of that's changing when it comes to Windows 11. And we're going to talk about different deployment methods, things we've seen customers do today in terms of keeping up with the build revisions as they iterate through and Microsoft continues to publish updates. And we're going to finally get into how you can structure some things around Intune, which is really the main focus of this. We're going to talk about different, what those rings are, some gotchas, things that you might want to consider as you continue to build out your servicing model. So anyone who's ever attended a presentation with me, I always like to start off with a question and just ask everyone how you're managing feature builds today, or are you managing feature builds today?
I'm not sure how we do it. Really not on me to do, but I am involved.
Yep, I think that's actually quite common with a lot of other enterprises. There's either it requires to do that effectively and to keep up with the cadence. It requires a lot of strategy and communication that I think is kind of a role change with IT as IT continues to evolve into the modern workspace. So when we talk about what it is, I mean, in short, it's a biannual software update approach, and it releases new features to Windows on a cadence that typically takes place in the first and second half of each calendar year. It's similar to how iOS and Android and iPad OS, they release different versions of software, but they do those typically on a single annual basis, where for Windows 10, it started out at 3 times a year, and then they've kind of rolled that back to 2. And other products like Windows Server also does a cadence where they release different builds, and SCCM, or Microsoft Configuration Endpoint Manager, Endpoint Configuration Manager, however they want to pronounce it today, does a three time a year cycle. So it's definitely something that Microsoft is continuing to do, and they believe in this in releasing quality updates, feature updates to get new features and functionality out to folks instead of waiting 5 or 6 years for the next version of Windows. So when we talk about their original deployment process, when Windows 10 was first released, Microsoft had a pretty good overview of how they wanted folks to test. They wanted you to have devices that lived in some of their insider previews. So maybe you've heard the term like fast ring or slow ring. And then once the testing and things of that build were complete, you would move it on to pilot. And they had two different methodologies, which was semi-annual channel targeted and semi-annual channel, as you can see. And when that occurred, what they had was the general public release that occurred. So that would be what the non-business folks would get. So if you were a consumer and had a consumer version of Windows 10, you would see your Windows 10 update or feature build update released in that time frame what they define here as pilot. And then once that was completed, you would move on to the business folks, or the enterprise folks would then have the ability to start rolling out that version of Windows 10. When that happened, you kind of got into this, the service model that we all talk about. And this is really the development of that service model, from development of the OS through to release. And so what you used to see as semi-annual channel targeted lived here in pilot and then broad deployment. And now that's kind of condensed down to where pilot, it's available to businesses the same day as it's available to an enterprise for whatever version of that feature is. And then you just kind of iterate through different rings or different departments, however you'd like to phrase it. And when you look at the beginning of this, they do a lot of internal testing before Microsoft makes it available to that insider preview branch, which is where you first start to see the new features that have done all of their internal validation. A lot of times I've recommended to people, if they want to do those sorts of things, if they want to do testing on new features, have a virtual machine or two that lives in different branches of insider preview. So whether it's fast ring or slow ring, whatever works with your team. Most people tend to stick with the slow ring because that's updated, I believe, monthly, and then the fast ring receives those new test builds. I think it's bi-weekly or weekly. And then as you kind of move through your deployment, you're working through whatever your environment looks like. So, and that brings us to talking about support. And, if you look at this 6-year span here on this slide, you have anywhere from 3 to 6 different versions of Windows being supported, with various dates. So if you look at 2021 and 2022 specifically, that's where things get a little crazy, because you've got, a lot. You've got 5 or 6 different versions of Windows that may be that are going to be published, and that really, with Microsoft announcing that Windows 11 is to be released sometime around, I think it's October 5th, as of today. That's going to add yet another OS to consider as you roll out feature builds. The plus side of that is that with Windows 11, Microsoft is taking a step back, and they are doing a 3-year, or it's going to be supported for 36 months. So if you were in a spring build, which was anything released in H1 or the first half of whatever year it was, you had 18 months. And then if it was a fall build, the fall build kind of fell under the 3-year timeline. And so Microsoft it looks like they're going to standardize for Windows 11 to only do a feature build once a year, which takes some of that complexity out of it as you move into Windows 11 from Windows 10. Does anyone have any questions about OS support dates before we move on? Okay. So when it comes to upgrading your feature builds, moving from one feature build of Windows to another, there are a lot of different ways you can do this. You can do this directly from Intune. You can build deployment plans and roll those out to various rings. You can do the same work through Windows Update for Business, or through WSUS, or through Microsoft InPlace Endpoint Configuration Manager. A lot of customers that I've seen recently have been using InPlace Upgrades, and we're going to talk about why they've been using InPlace Upgrades to move from one version of Windows 10 to the next here in a bit. So InPlace Upgrades, in my opinion, they provide a lot more granular control. So if you've got a tool on-prem that you're rolling out, that you can you run InPlace upgrades or do imaging from. A lot of people are leveraging InPlace upgrades, and part of that is that you have you can decide, hey, you know what, maybe I've got software that's updating on a similar cadence. If you've noticed, companies like Symantec are releasing different builds of their antivirus because Microsoft is releasing different builds of their OS. And a lot of times they try to stay in lockstep with that rollout. So you may have a lot of internal apps that you want to control that upgrade process on the device. And so people are using InPlace upgrades. It also happens quite a bit because in the beginning, I saw a lot of customers who wanted to continue to treat Windows as we want to continue to do this every 5-year, 6-year cadence where they would standardize on one version of Windows. There weren't all these feature updates. They just had the version of Windows, and then through attrition or through end of support, we would swap the OS out. And a lot of that happened with, if you all remember, long-term service channel or long-term service branch, as it was formerly known. That version of Windows was really designed to be more of a kiosk sort of long-term manufacturing system where you don't have a lot of change on those devices. And they really wanted people to be in this feature build update. And when you got into long-term servicing channel, you lost certain Windows features. They took away the ability to have like Cortana. Edge was not included in long-term service channel. Excuse me, Windows OSs. And with that, if you've only got Internet Explorer, Internet Explorer is still supported, but that doesn't mean they're adding new features to it to support modern web browsing. So by standardizing on an OS that doesn't have the ability to run those things natively, you might run into some conflicts as you continue to iterate through. The other issue, or I wouldn't even call it an issue, the other challenge that I've seen businesses run into is they get behind in feature builds. So someone may run a version they may be on 1809, for example, and they need to go to a more supported version. Well, the only way to do that, once you get behind in those builds, you have two options. You can do an InPlace upgrade, which is a one-time upgrade, a one-time inconvenience to your users, or you can do a step build where you say, okay, I'm going to go from 1809 to 1909, and then from 1909 to 20H2 or whatever build you're ultimately standardizing, which creates another hoop for your end user base to jump through and another bit of downtime for them. So a lot of folks are just saying, you know what, we're going to do InPlace upgrades. We haven't really quite got our methodology in place. So because of that, we just do InPlace upgrades and we update our drivers and do all of that work. So if you've got Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, you have some basic things that you need to have in place in order to manage your feature builds. You don't have to have Intune, but it's recommended that you do. You can leverage desktop analytics to get a lot of information about your environment, which we talked about desktop analytics in the past in this series. But you really just have to have a server that is set up to be your software update point. You've got to have the proper classifications enabled for that software update point. You need to go in and make sure you have the Windows 10 products enabled, and there's a lot of different ones there. You can include drivers if you want to do that. You don't have to, but manufacturers, if you look at Lenovo, for example, they're releasing driver packs a lot of times based on build now. So if you're doing an update, I highly recommend trying to keep drivers updated. Once you do that, once you have all of those things configured, you just create a deployment and push it out to your environment. So it looks like we had a question come in here. Chris, can you read that to me?
Says, are upgrades cumulative? In other words, if you skip an update and install a newer update, do you get all that was included in the previous update version you did not install?
Sure. So if you go from, say, let's say you're going from version 1909 to say 20H2 or 20H1, you will get all of those features. So all the features that maybe were released between fall builds, you would receive all of those updates. So those features aren't left out. They are included. You're welcome. All right, so when we're talking about building rings for Intune, you have to have, you don't want to target your entire fleet of devices all at once. It's recommended you do things like pull systems from different locations, different departments, and establish a frequency that they can expect these builds to be deployed. It's really important to have a strategy when you're building this cadence, so that your end users understand and your management understands and leadership knows, hey, you know what, we have to do this. This is part of security. This is part of keeping our environment healthy, and this is how we're going to iterate through this process. And a lot of companies standardize on the fall build. But in order to do feature builds within Intune, you need to have a supported Windows 10 version. So if you are on a version that is not supported, then you have to move to a supported version before you can continue down that path. The device has to be enrolled in Intune, and it's got to be either joined to Azure AD or hybrid Azure AD joined. You also have to have telemetry enabled. That is part of desktop analytics. So if you're leveraging desktop analytics today, telemetry is probably already enabled. And you just have to make sure that you're properly licensed from a Windows OS perspective. And so speaking of licensing, you want to make sure that you have either an E3 or A5 license, or if you're using Microsoft 365 Business Premium, you've got to have that license available to you, or if you're using Virtual Desktop, a per user license for that. But other than that, that's really all you need from a licensing perspective on the OS. So I feel like we missed a slide somewhere. Okay, so actually, oh, it's this one's okay. I see what happened here. So for for update compliance, you can use desktop analytics or Windows Health and Monitoring in Intune to track where you're at from a compliance perspective once you establish your rings and start to roll those things out. So if you see here what we're looking at, we have desktop analytics, and you can see a summary of both, like what your security updates look like and what your feature updates look like. You can see what's in service, near end of service, or stuff that maybe is not measured. Not measured could be anything that's old. It could be it could be like an older version of Windows 7, Windows 8, for example, that maybe still exists in your environment. You can also see the number of enrolled devices and apps that are there. If you have concerns about app compatibility, for example, when it comes to rolling out your different builds, that's why desktop analytics is so important, is you can go back and look at desktop analytics and look at your apps and say, okay, these apps, based on the information that Microsoft has, these apps are already compatible with the next version of Windows. And that shortens, if you have a very thorough testing process that your enterprise requires you to go through, that shortens that testing process considerably. That the old classic upgrade model where you had to do all this rigorous testing with all of your different app owners, a lot of that can be streamlined now with desktop analytics. Likewise, you have different reports that you can run from Windows Health. Now, this is still in preview, but you can see all the different profiles or rings that you've built, all the different versions of the OS that you're rolling out, and you can see which ones are successful, which ones are in progress. You can see all of the different statuses for those devices for Windows 8, Windows 10, and that also includes feature updates or Windows updates as well. So when it comes to ring design, there's a lot of different ideas. I prefer to keep my rings simple. When you add a lot of different testing, a lot of different rings for like every single line of business, it creates a lot of different complexity. So I try to have, we have our test update ring, and that could be, for insider preview, where you could set that ring up where these couple of machines, they're always going to get the insider preview rollout every time it comes in. That gives you that chance to establish a testing cadence once a month where you've got some VMs that have your standard applications that are there for your end users, and you just go in and, hey, I'm going to use this ERP app or this line of business app that's critical. See how it works with some of the newer versions of Windows. But when you're establishing like your rollout, once these builds are available for for production use, a lot of folks start with IT pilot. I like to have an IT pilot group, maybe one or two of those, depending on the size of your IT group. And then we do like a friends and family, which is the best name I've ever heard. Definitely not mine, but I love that name. So I use it quite a bit. And friends and family really is just, you've got your folks in different lines of business or different departments or different offices that are IT friendly. They're the folks that are going to reach out to you, that are going to provide feedback, want to be those early adopters. And those are the people you want to get feedback from first before you start rolling out those feature builds. From there, I like to move to like business critical apps or critical lines of business, where you have a smattering of those things throughout your environment, and you keep those folks in that critical line of business, because before you start doing a broad deployment to the rest of your environment, you want to make sure that you're checking on those critical apps. And then from there, once all of your testing is back and you've ran your reports and you get all that information, you start moving to like a broad deployment. And depending on the size of your environment, you may have only a few hundred people left after you move through those first 3 rings, where you're just like, okay, this is available to everybody else. And you can set up, how long those folks want to defer those updates. Maybe you want to give them a 1 week time to defer getting that update. And so you would just structure that appropriately. So you'd have like a week deferral from release, then maybe a 2 week deferral from release for the next group, a 3 week deferral, 4 week deferral, whatever time you need as an IT group to get through testing, get through your validation, get through whatever your approval processes are, and move it on to the next group. And then I personally like to keep executives and VIPs separate when it comes to changes to their OS. We all know that executives and VIPs can be maybe more vocal or more touchy-feely about changes happening to their OS. And for that instance, I like to break out like my executives and VIPs before we get for those folks, just to keep things calm. Does anyone have any questions about rings before we move on? This one's a pretty quick cover.
Hey Chris, quick question for you. The executive ring, that the 00, which I think is great. Would that be considered maybe a like a white glove, or you treat them just slightly different?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Like depending on how you want to structure that with those executives, allow that to not be forced on them, or setting up your deployments so that they have the option to choose, or they don't get notified, right? We all know that the last thing we want to hear about is an executive who's doing a PowerPoint presentation to maybe your board and gets a pop-up notification in their window that says, hey, you know what? We're going to reboot your machine in a half hour. Like that absolutely, you would want to treat them in a much different manner than the rest of your lines of business. All right. And lastly, really, we want to talk about when it comes to feature builds, the most important thing you can do is really start with a strategy. You have to work with the folks in your business to develop a strategy on how you want to release these updates. Included in that means how you're going to monitor and report your success on your upgrades or impact of those upgrades to those apps. When it comes to the classic model of how folks would are so conditioned to do testing, even still today, they don't quite understand why they have to do why you have to go through testing, why you do testing every year, and they think that you have to do that rigorous testing that you used to do every 5 or 6 years. They think you have to do that every year. And if you're leveraging a lot of the tools that are available to you, you can start to mitigate all of that and say, you know what, hey, here's our top critical business apps. Pull that information from desktop analytics and say, we've ran this against what Microsoft says, and guess what? These apps are known to be good based on the information that Microsoft gathers from other folks who are also using those applications. Now that may change a bit if you have a business critical app that's in-house developed. That where those apps fall you'll probably end up with a report that says something like not enough information, which means really that just Microsoft doesn't know or have enough information to determine whether or not that application is going to be compatible with the new version. But it can make a determination based on the application requirements. So, hey, you know what? We think this is going to be supported because it's got these versions of .NET. These versions are deprecated, right? It's not a Windows 95 app that you built that you haven't changed. We can look at some of the things from the MSI and make a suggestion. And apply, again, like we talked about, applying your upgrades to different lines of business, focusing on breaking those things out and mitigating the risk and impact to your business. And making sure that the folks that are leaders in your business understand what that impact is going to be. In all of the time that I've been doing these feature builds, the biggest question that's come up is, isn't this like doing an InPlace upgrade or, like upgrading my OS completely? And at first it felt like it was because of the time it took. But as Microsoft has moved through this process, they've really made it much quicker. And so it does behave in a lot more of it behaves in a lot more of like a regular Windows update fashion. They want you to look at this as more of just another Windows update. Like you should do your standard cadence and standard testing, but you really look at it like a Windows update. And then standardize on fall builds. Fall builds give you a much longer time for patches, for quality and security updates, and that can give you the time you need to structure your structure your testing and do your testing and then start to roll those things out. Just keep in mind that when you get 2 versions behind, that becomes a little more difficult to jump through. You can certainly just jump to, skip one version and then go to your supported version. But just understand that depending on how your environment works and how your environment behaves, you may want to consider doing an in-place upgrade so they have a one-time change. Does anyone have any questions on the feature builds before we continue on? We're just about wrapped up, actually. All right. So that kind of does it for this. Chris, you have anything here you'd like to add?
No, that was pretty much no other questions. You have a couple more slides in here, or
Nope,
never
just
mind.
the
My
question
screen,
slide.
for some reason, my screen wasn't synced. Sorry. So anyways, yeah, no other questions, but I do want to call out our schedule for the remainder of our 2021 webinar series. As you can see here, we are in the September 14th, getting to know Windows as a service. We do have a change that we are proposing or planning on to make in our November session. So our November session was originally going to be a kind of a wrap up of all of the different sessions that we have gone through so far, kind of to pull together the development and implementation of a endpoint management strategy. With the announcement of Windows 11 as well as Windows 365, there's some interest around what's new and what those are bringing to the table for Microsoft 365 cloud services. So we are going to change our November session to focus on an introduction to Windows 11 and Windows 365, and hopefully we'll have the available resources by that time. I know Microsoft is struggling to keep up with the demand for trials and whatnot, but hopefully we'll have the resources by that time to kind of walk through those and give everyone an introduction to those two new flavors of Windows, so to speak. But anyways, I appreciate everyone for taking the time to join us today. We'll stick around for a few more minutes if there are any other questions, but otherwise, great job, Chris, and we'll hope to see you next month at our October webinar session. Thank you.